This video is the first of 3 that go with Section 43 of Hansen and Quinn's Greek An Intensive course and covers the passive voice in all the tenses of the indicative. You can refer to Hansen and Quinn pages 111 to 122 for their coverage of the material, and they revisit it in the appendix on all sorts of pages. When you first learned about Greek verbs way back in Unit 2, we talked about how we look at 5 things in a verb form: tense, mood, voice, person, and number. As a review, Greek regularly uses 6 different tenses: present, imperfect, future, aorist, perfect, and pluperfect. You've now met all of those tenses in the indicative mood, and you've learned the present and aorist of the subjunctive and the optative. We're going to save the imperative for Unit 11. You've learned present, aorist, and perfect infinitives, and there will also be participles. Of the 3 voices in Greek, active, middle, and passive, all of the verbs you've learned so far have been in the active voice, in which the subject of the verb is doing the action of the verb. You also know first, second, and third person now, and that Greek has singular, dual, and plural in number, but that we don't use dual very much. Now it's time to learn to form all those persons and numbers and tenses and moods in the passive voice. We'll come back to middle voice in Unit 7. What then is the passive voice? Let's learn it in English first. So here's an English sentence: Helen hits Leo. The subject is Helen, the verb is hits, and the direct object is Leo. This is in the active voice because the grammatical subject of the sentence, Helen, is doing the action of the verb hits. Now let's turn it around. Leo is hit. Now Leo is the grammatical subject of the sentence, and the verb is both words is hit, and there is no direct object. The passive voice can't have one because the grammatical subject receives the action of the verb. That's the job of the direct object in an active sentence. The subject is Leo here, and he's receiving the blow. He received the blow when he was the direct object in the active sentence, but there he was receiving it as the direct object of an active verb. Here in this sentence, he receives the action of the verb as the grammatical subject of a passive verb. Mistakes were made is famously passive. Since the passive voice doesn't say who's doing the action of the verb, you can avoid stating responsibility. The passive mistakes were made doesn't tell you who made the mistakes, which is active. Now you can specify who does the action in a passive sentence. In English, we would say Leo is hit by Helen. By Helen is the prepositional phrase that tells you who the agent, the doer of the action is. Greek has a way of doing it too. Most of the time, it's also with a preposition, hupa plus the genitive. Here we're actually translating by Helen, hupa tes Helenes. This is called the genitive of personal agent. You can always use this when you need or want to specify the agent or doer of a passive verb. When there's an alternative to genitive of personal agent, I'll tell you about it. All right, let's get on with learning to form the present indicative passive. As you know, all things present are from the first principal part, and then we'll need verb endings. Our favorite verb is luo, and we're going to look at the first principal part, make the stem by taking off the omega. Now, we get some brand new endings. Here they are: omai, a or a, etai, ometha, estha, ontai. I'm also going to introduce you to another useful paradigm on the side, the primary passive person markers, to help you identify person and number and the fact that you're looking at a passive verb. So here are these. my, psi, tai, metha, stha, ntai. If you look, you can see those endings in all the persons and numbers after omicron or epsilon, which help us see we're in the present tense in the paradigm for the present indicative passive. Now, I'm sure you're dying to know what's going on with the second person singular. Well, it should have been SI, epsilon plus the secondary person marker. That asterisk is an indication that this is a supposed form that doesn't exist in Attic Greek, but that is helpful in understanding the form that does exist. Anyway, SI doesn't make Attic Greek happy because Attic Greek, for whatever reason, tends to drop the sigma sound between vowels, the S sound between vowels. That's called an intervocalic, a between the vowels sigma. And in this case, then the vowels contract together and either smooshes up the epsilon and the alpha to get an eta with the iota stuffed underneath, or it loses the alpha in the epsilon's eagerness to form a diphthong with the iota. Okay, so that explains the second person singular and its two forms. The accent for present indicative passive is recessive. The default translation is she is verbed or she is being verbed, because this is present time with simple aspect or present time with progressive repeated aspect. Now let's see this in action. We need the first principal part stem plus the endings. Amai, a or a, etai, ometha, estha, and ontai. Then we need recessive accent. Remember that alpha iota at the end of a word counts as short for the purposes of accent. So that's where our accents go. And so we have luomai, I am freed, lue or lue, you are freed, luatai, she is freed, luamatha, we are freed, luastha, y'all are freed, and luontai, they are freed. Notice lue, the one with the epsilon and the iota, because it can be two things you know now. You are freed, the form of the present indicative passive in the second singular that you just learned, or she frees, the present indicative active third person singular. Context will have to tell you which one. Also look at lue with the eta and the iota subscript, because it can be two things you know now. You are freed that you just learned, or the present subjunctive active third person singular. Back to our current paradigm, if you want to say who's responsible for the action in these passive verbs, you use the genitive of personal agent, which isn't really part of the paradigm, but remember, that's what you need if you want to give credit for the action in the verb. So here we actually have Helen taking responsibility again. Let's move on to the imperfect indicative passive, which will be, as all imperfects, from the first principal part and the endings, but we'll need to add the past indicative augment. So here's good old luo and our augmented first principal part tense stem. Now, once again, we're going to get some brand new endings. Amen, u, eta, amatha, esthe, anta. You can see that these person markers are different, and you knew when I introduced primary passive person markers, you were also going to get to see secondary passive person markers. And those are main, sa, ta, metha, stha, nta. If you look, you can see these endings in all the persons and numbers of the imperfect indicative passive after that omicron or epsilon. Once again, the second person singular is messing with the pattern. Well, it should have been eso, as the secondary person markers would indicate. But Attic Greek, again, wants to lose the intervocalic sigma, and then the vowels contract together, and epsilon and omicron always contract into the diphthong u. The accent in imperfect indicative passive is recessive, and the default translation is she was being verbed, because this is past time and progressive repeated aspect. So here's the imperfect indicative passive of luo. Augment, stem, and endings, and we get eluamen, eluu, elueta, eluametha, eluestha, eluanta, which mean I was being freed, you were being freed, she was being freed, we were being freed, y'all were being freed, and they were being freed. Again, if you need to specify who's doing the action of a passive verb, you'll use the genitive of personal agent. All right, time to move on to the future indicative passive, which we'll use principal part 6. Finally, we get to use that last principal part. If you look at the sixth principal part, you'll see that it has the past indicative augment on it because it's an aorist form that we'll meet shortly. So, to get the future passive stem, we'll have to start by taking off the augment. Then, for the future indicative passive, we also have to add what's called an infix, 2 letters that are going to go in the middle of a word, and those 2 letters are ace, are eta sigma. And then, on top of that, we'll add the endings. So, we go to the sixth principal part, eluthane, and that becomes our stem by taking off the ain and the epsilon. Now, this time I'm putting all the passive person markers here, but you know that we're going to use the primary ones because future is a primary tense. And you are right. In fact, as you can see, these endings are the same endings exactly as the present indicative passive. The accent is recessive, and the default translation is she will be verbed or she will be being verbed because it's future time with simple aspect or a progressive repeated aspect. Let's see what the full forms of the future indicative passive look like. Here's the unaugmented tense stem from the sixth principal part. You have to remember to add the ace, and then the endings and the accents. And so we get luthesomai, I will be freed, luthese, you will be freed, which could also be luthese spelled with an epsilon iota at the end, luthesetai, she will be freed, luthesometha, we will be freed, luthesestha, y'all will be freed, and luthesontai, they will be freed. By the way, this is the form of the Randolph College Classics Department's Greek motto, thou mas the sometha. Here it is in caps. It's from Pericles' funeral oration in Book 2 of Thucydides' History, and it means, we shall be wondered at. It's future indicative passive, first person plural, so we are the subject, but we are not doing the action of the verb. Somebody else is, and we are receiving the action of the verb, receiving the wonder. By whom, we don't specify. If we did, though, it would be in the genitive of agent. Hypotes Hellenes here is pretty accurate, though, because my daughter Helen thinks we're pretty awesome. Let's move on to the aorist indicative passive. As I hinted, we'll be using the sixth principal part, plus endings to make person and number. So let's take eluthane and make it a stem by taking off the ain. This time, though, we keep the augment because we are doing the past and we are doing the indicative with the aorist indicative passive. This time, I'm not going to show you the primary and secondary passive person markers because the aorist passive looks pretty active in its person markers. So here are the endings. Ein, ace, amen, ate, ason. Accent is recessive. The default translation is she was verbed because we are in past time, simple aspect. You can see the familiar sigma at the end of the second person singular, and the men at the end of the first person plural, and the te in the y'all form of the second person plural. Even the son in the third person plural you've seen in the pluperfect indicative active endings. So you know it's passive and not active this time not because of the endings, but because of the sixth principal part. But you should still be pretty familiar with which person and number it is because you know those person markers from your active learning. So let's conjugate. Here are all the forms, sixth principal part plus ending with recessive accent. Eleuthein, I was freed. Eleuthes, you were freed. Eleuthe, she was freed. Eleuthemen, we were freed. Eleutheta, y'all were freed. And eleutheson, they were freed. If you need to know by whom, you still make it a genitive of personal agent. Now, for the perfect indicative passive. I know you've been dying to know when, if ever, we were going to use principal part 5, and now's our time. We'll require endings for person and number as usual, and we'll take our stem from the fifth principal part. You take off the my, and you get as your stem lalu. Because we're passive and in a primary tense, we're going to use the primary person markers. And here's my favorite part about the perfect. You take those primary person markers and you just slap those endings onto the stem. No foolishness about the second person singular and intervocalic sigmas. It's just my, psi, tai, methas, the, in, tai. The accent is recessive. The default translation is she has been verbed because we are in present time and completed aspect. So all put together, it's going to look like this. Lelumai, I have been freed. Lelusai, you have been freed. Lelutai, she has been freed. Lelumetha, we have been freed. Lelustha, y'all have been freed. And Leluntai, they have been freed. If we want to know by whom they have been freed, with the perfect tense, you can use dative of personal agent without a preposition. So by Helen would be te Helene, as I've put here. This is dative of personal agent, no preposition. Now, the genitive of personal agent, hupa and the genitive, hupa tes Helenes, as we've been looking at it, would work fine too, but you can use dative of personal agent with the perfect tense. Finally, we're going to do pluperfect indicative passive, rarely seen, but good to know. We're going to use the fifth principal part again. The same as for the perfect indicative passive. And to make it past time, we're going to have to add the past indicative augment. We'll require endings for person and number, as usual. To get the augmented tense stem from the fifth principal part, you take off the my, and you add the augment to the front of the stem. And you get elelu. Now, because we're passive and in a secondary tense, we're going to use the secondary passive person markers. And again, you just slap those endings onto the augmented fifth principal part stem. No silliness about the second person singular and intervocalic sigmas. You just take the stem, add the augment, and put main saw ta, methasthen ta on the ends. The accent is recessive. The default translation is she had been verbed because we are in past time with completed aspect. So, all put together, it looks like this, with the augment, the fifth principal part stem, and the endings, plus our recessive accent. We get elelumain, I had been freed, elelusa, you had been freed, eleluta, she had been freed, elelumetha, we had been freed, elelustha, y'all had been freed, and elelunta, they had been freed. If we want to know by whom, as with the perfect tense, the pluperfect can use the dative of personal agent, the dative without a preposition, but genitive of agent works fine here too. That was a very long video, but it should have all that you need to be able to practice and use the passive voice in 6 tenses of the indicative. In the next video, we'll cover the passive of the subjunctive, the optative, and the infinitives that you know.